Good evening. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the final lecture of the 2019 Engineering Lecture Series. My name is Lisa Gromlich, and I am Dean of the College of the Environment. You might think, why is the College of the Environment Dean introducing this lecture? Since I got here about 9 years ago, one of the sources of great joy and satisfaction for me has been the partnership that the College of the Environment has with the College of Engineering. We are frequent collaborators and we frequently do things together. We are both invested in finding solutions to problems that impact human life and the health of the planet, and many of our collaborations lie at the interface of the natural world and of infrastructure. Our speaker today is a leader in one of those shared initiatives, the Freshwater Initiative. If you think about it, freshwater, shall we say, flows across many academic disciplines and across many industries. Most issues involving freshwater are so complex that no single discipline, no single academic department can tackle those problems alone. And so to respond to the growing research needs, faculty at the College of Engineering, the College of the Environment, and UW-Tacoma together formed the Freshwater Initiative in 2014. We've done a number of things together in that initiative, and one was hiring a cluster of brand new faculty, one of whom you're going to meet tonight. So the project that Gordon Holtgrieve is talking to you about tonight demonstrates the interdisciplinary nature of this initiative in these two colleges. So Dr. Gordon Holtgrieve is the H. Mason Keeler Associate Professor of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences in the College of the Environment. Gordon is an ecosystem ecologist and fisheries scientist, and his lab, the Holtgrieve Ecosystem Ecology Lab, or HEEL, explores how terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems function and connect, especially how elements like carbon move through those systems. His research spans the globe, including here in the Puget Sound, in Alaska, and in Southeast Asia. Gordon and his colleagues have published more than 30 scientific papers, and Gordon received his PhD in zoology here at the University of Washington, and it is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Gordon Holtgrieve.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the College of Engineering for inviting me. It's really an honor to come speak at this lecture series. I want to start by making two apologies. One, I have some hearing problems right now. I have a bit of a thing going on in my ear, so I can't hear so well. So if I'm too loud or too soft, just let me know. The other is, which may be obvious now, is I want to apologize. I'm not an engineer. I'm actually not an engineer. I'm sorry about this. The reality is that as a child, I wasn't very focused. I probably should have been an engineer. It meets all my interests. I couldn't handle the math. I just couldn't do it. What I was, though, was a fish nerd. And this is a family trait, actually. This is a picture of me and my father about 1980 in the desert of Nevada. And what we're looking at here is probably all the individuals that represent the species of this pupfish right here, which is just this amazing little fish that lives in the desert. It can survive in water where there's ice on the top, basically 33 degrees. It can survive in water that's 120 in the summer. It's an amazing species. And this has always really captivated me, and it's kind of carried me through my education and into science. And this has been really influential, but over time and through the advising of a number of really wonderful mentors, including Lisa Gromlich, I've come to learn that being passionate about that one thing, in my case fish, is great, but if you want to solve problems, it's not enough. Right? What we need to do is we need to get out of our comfort zone. We need to work with individuals that are trained in disciplines outside of ourselves. What we need to do is we need to try to become that kind of T-shaped scientist, we call it, where we're deep in one area, but then broad, where we can relate to multiple disciplines. And that's what it's going to take, that kind of interdisciplinary perspective, is what it's going to take if we're going to want to solve real world problems. So the story I'm going to tell you about today is about freshwater fisheries in general and some of the issues that are going on with them, and then a little bit of specifics about the Mekong River. But the message I want to give you is that we need to foster this interdisciplinary integration and get outside of our comfort zone and really work together to solve problems. So I like to start these talks by setting the stage on a big picture, right? And this is the big picture. This is one of the grand challenges that society faces, right? We have 7 billion people, more than 7 billion people on the planet right now. We're on track to somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people. At the same time, people are getting wealthier, both individually and collectively. We've got technology changing like crazy. Some of that's for the better, some of that's for the worse. And this all adds up to impact on the environment. This is the IPAT equation that John Holdren and Paul Ehrlich developed in the early 1970s. And it's just stating that, humans are having an increasing footprint on the planet. And at the time, this was kind of in a conservation context about the species that we were going to lose if this was going to carry on. And since then, we've kind of developed this idea that humans are really dependent on ecosystems too. And what we're doing with this impact is really going to come back to affect us. And so this is the idea of ecosystem services, that there's a whole host of things that human societies get from ecosystems for free, most of the cases, and this is things that are obvious, like fresh water, or maybe food resources, building materials, and things that are maybe not so obvious. Pollination of plants, or aesthetics and spirituality of place. And as this population grows and as our activities grow, these ecosystem services are shrinking. And this is going to impact us. And it's a huge challenge. And for our current generation, this is an issue, but future generations, they're going to have to tackle this. And so we need to come up with solutions to try to deal with these problems. So this is, a big picture thing in the collective, but it also, at the individual level, it's going to play out a little interesting. And so if you take an idea of what does environmental change mean for people, and you think about it in terms of human health in this case, you've got environmental change, those impact ecosystem services, and there's going to be some impact on health outcomes over here, but it's not going to affect everybody equally. There's going to be factors that are going to determine whether you're more at risk or less at risk to this environmental change and loss of ecosystem services. And the big one here is fairly obvious. It's poverty, right? If you are relatively impoverished, if you don't have many resources, you are going to feel the brunt of this environmental change much more acutely than those with resources. And I would argue that freshwaters and the freshwater ecosystems, this is happening on all ecosystems, or many ecosystems, but freshwaters, this is really acute. This is happening fast, in a big way, and these ecosystems provide some really unique and critical ecosystem services for people. And so I want to talk about that part first, and then talk about some research work that we're doing around this a little bit later. So I mentioned that freshwaters are being highly impacted around the globe, and this is some work by colleague Charles Vorsmarty and others who tried to quantify this, put some numbers and put it on a map. What they did was they took something like 37 metrics of impacts to freshwater, and they distilled them down to whether they were impacts to biodiversity, species, or impacts to water security, and then plotted them on the map. And what you see here is a few things. One is that everywhere there's water, except for the high Arctic, there's something going on. There's an impact here, right? There's a very few places on the planet, really remote places like the Amazon here, where you're not seeing these impacts. The other thing you see here is that threats to water security and biodiversity kind of go hand in hand, right? There's a lot of red on this map where you've got both. Turns out about 80% of the people on the planet live in one of these areas that's colored either red or yellow. And so it's touching a whole lot of people. So we're changing these ecosystems fairly dramatic and in a number of ways. Down here on the bottom, I'm showing some examples of the ways that these ecosystems are changing. We're doing things like fragmenting rivers and changing hydrologic regimes as a result of damming. taking water out of rivers and lakes for agriculture, for example. And then the one on the end there are zebra mussels. This is kind of a classic example of invasive species and how these invasive species can really change the way ecosystems work. So that's the threat side. What about the services side? And a while back, a colleague of mine, I'm not going to name names, but we were chatting about freshwater fisheries and kind of their role in the world, and they made the point like, freshwater fisheries are like 10% of total fisheries catch, right? They're actually pretty small. There's about 70 million metric tons of marine fisheries catches in the world. That's up there, the blue line. And if you look down at the very bottom line, that's freshwater fish, right? These are the things I love as an individual. And then, like, it's 10%. There's like 7 million metric tons. Not that big of a deal. And so I'm, oh no, tuck my tail, run back to my office, have a cry, think about this, and say, well, maybe the amount doesn't really matter. Maybe there's something more to it. And so dug into this a little bit more and thought, well, where are these catches, right? Where are people getting these resources? And one thing popped out here is that, yeah, in North America and Europe, Central and South America, not actually a big deal, but Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, these are a big deal, and they're increasing, right? Those areas, the population's growing, and people are increasingly using this resource. So it's meaningful for certain parts of the world. Here's another way to look at it. This is a plot. Every dot on this map here is a country, and they're color-coded by region, you can see here. And on this axis, we've got per capita GDP. This is essentially the wealth of the country, right? We've got relatively poor countries and relatively wealthy countries on this side. And then on the y-axis, we've got total animal protein consumed per person. And there's a pretty strong relationship. We've known this for a really long time, actually. The richer you are, the more meat you tend to eat. That's not surprising. But what I've done here is I've now scaled these dots relative to the proportion of that animal protein that comes from freshwater fish, right? And a pretty obvious pattern jumps out at you is that the countries on the low end of the economic scale get a much higher proportion of their already small amount of animal protein from freshwater fish. And so the reality here is this is, in many ways, a protein of last resort for people who can't get it. And I always say that, if the big earthquake hit tomorrow, and all of our systems shut down, I know exactly what I'm doing, which is grabbing my fishing pole, right? And that's how I'm going to get by. And that's what people do, right? When they need to get food, they're often looking at those fresh waters, those streams and lakes in their backyard as a place to get food. Okay, so taking this a little bit further, we can think, well, how vulnerable is this freshwater fish resource for people around the globe? And there's a lot of literature about how you calculate these vulnerability index, but it basically boils down to this idea that you've got some dependence on a resource, and that dependence is relative to a threshold of need. And so here we have some information about the dependence. We know what countries are fairly well dependent on this resource. The threshold here is the amount of protein needed to be a healthy individual. And the World Health Organization says that you need about 83 grams of protein per kilogram per day to be healthy. And many of these countries are at that level. There's threat, right? It's important to know if these resources are at threat. And then there's adaptive capacity here. And this is the ability of countries or individuals to do something about it when they have a problem, right? And so that's often related to things like governance. If you have good governance, you usually can be adaptive in your response. If you have healthcare, if you have good education, if there's overall wealth in a country, those countries can be fairly adaptive. So just calculating this index and plotting it on a map and showing basically only the countries that are in the top 20%, pattern pops out. Where are the areas that are vulnerable to the loss of freshwater fish resources? Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. These are the places where we have developing countries coming up, and that there's high dependence as well as high vulnerability on this resource. If you look in terms of the number of people, and just in this upper category, these most vulnerable countries, for the loss of this resource. It's about 500 million people, actually. And so while it's not big overall, it's big for a subset of people. We could take this a little bit farther and say, well, how do these countries look in other metrics that are uniquely vulnerable to this resource? And a couple of patterns pop out is that countries that are vulnerable to the loss of the resource also tend to be relatively poor countries. Not all poor countries are dependent on this resource, but ones that are also relatively poor. Not surprising, it actually goes in the calculation, but good to know. Countries that have malnutrition, problems with malnutrition. This is stunting in children under 5 as a percent, and many of the countries that are vulnerable to the loss of this resource also have issues of malnutrition. And then this last graph down here plots an index of environmental performance index that's produced by a group at Yale, and it's basically ranking countries in their ability to deal with issues in the environment. Do they have good environmental laws? Do they have the capacity to affect change? And again, you see that a lot of these countries that are really vulnerable for this resource tend to be on the low end of that scale of environmental performance. So, to kind of summarize this, what we've got is we've got a resource that is maybe not big in total numbers and maybe not super valuable in an economic sense, but for people, certain people, relatively poor people, it's quite valuable. These fisheries are incredibly productive, right? They produce a lot of food for a relatively small amount of area, right? Freshwaters make up a very small area, and they produce a lot of food. It's high quality food for people. It also has high labor participation. There's lots of activity around freshwater fisheries. If you look here, there's hundreds of people active in these fisheries. There's common issues around these fisheries. There's generally a lack of property rights. The people that are active in these fisheries don't have rights to those fisheries. And then one issue that is important is that they're very data poor. We know very little about these systems and how they work, and as a result, we don't have good strategies on how to manage them. So with that, I want to switch gears a little bit. I have to say that, after going through this exercise, I certainly feel better with the conversation with my colleague. I feel like, okay, I can do this now. I got a motivation. So I'll switch gears here and turn to some work that myself and colleagues have been doing in the Mekong River, which is really a classic example of one of these freshwater systems that have really important freshwater fisheries that are really connected to the social, the ecological systems that are there. So just to orient you, the Mekong River is in Southeast Asia, and it's in the upper part of the watershed. The countries are China and Burma. In the lower part of the watershed, there are four countries that border the river. That's Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And so here's headwaters in the Himalayas and exits down in the South China Sea. In particular, I'm going to zoom in on Cambodia here. This is the river itself, Mekong River, and this is the Tonle Sap Lake. It's the largest lake in Southeast Asia. It's often called the heart of the Mekong, and I'll show you why here in a second. And Cambodia is really interesting and great place for a fish nerd to play, and for a couple of reasons. Well, it's a developing country that has the highest per capita protein, freshwater fish as protein intake. So the biggest dot on that plot I showed you before was Cambodia, and they eat quite a bit of freshwater fish. It's a relatively poor country, a developing economy, developing very, very, very rapidly. This is the currency here, and the name of the currency is the reel, and that fish right there is tray reel. All right? And so the currency is named after the fish, and in a very real and tangible way, fish equals money in this system, and that plays out in a lot of ways. And so this is just, the fisheries here are incredibly intense. Almost everybody are active in fisheries. Every one of these little white dots you see down here in this video is a fishing net. These little things along the side of the river are what are called arrow traps, and what they're doing is the fish that are migrating down this river come and they hit that fence, and then they turn and move back towards the center of the river, and at the end of those is a little trap that they got caught in, and you can see there's dozens of these things on both inside corners of this river. There's literally, probably 1,000 people active in this fishery in this one location in Cambodia. I mean, it's just incredibly intense system that touches a whole bunch of people. And so, for fish nerds like myself, this is a really classic system that people have thought about this and been crawling around the Mekong for looking at cool fish for a long time. There's almost 1,000 species of fish in the Mekong. It's the second most biodiverse river system in terms of number of species of fish, next to the Amazon. And then there's all these crazy individuals, right? There's these really big, charismatic fish that makes it on TV. They've got the giant Mekong catfish up here. This thing gets about 9 feet long and a few hundred pounds. And it's just, if a fisherman was able to catch one of those, that's a huge windfall for them. Giant Siamese barb, this thing gets 5 feet and again, a couple hundred pounds. Freshwater dolphins, all these really cool things that people have thought about. And if you got cool things, then you get guys like this that want to show up and put a hook in their mouth, right? And so we've got monster fish, the one that didn't get away, came to show, look, I got my giant Siamese barb. I happen to know where this is, and it turns out that those houses that you see in the background, this is a development of relatively wealthy people where they have a man-made lake that they stocked with these species. And they couldn't actually find them in the wild, so they had to show up here and catch them and take pictures of them. But that gives you a sense of what's happening out there. But if we're talking about what feeds people and what's important in terms of a resource, it's this, right? It's small silverfish, right? Really, really biodiverse. Lots and lots of species. This lower picture down here, I sat one day and tried to count up the number of species, and I quit at like 25. I couldn't do it anymore. They all look the same, but it's incredibly diverse. Small, used in a whole bunch of different ways, right? A lot of fish are fermented for fish paste. This is a staple in Cambodian cuisine, are fermented fish pastes. Smoked or dried, filleted, all sorts of ways. It's a rice and fish culture. Fish is eaten in every meal. And it's freshwater fish for Cambodians for the most part. So to kind of sum up a little bit about what fish mean to Cambodia and to the Lower Mekong, so looking at the Lower Mekong as a whole, there's about 60 million, a little more than 60 million people live in. They have the highest per capita average consumption of freshwater fish in the world. They have huge fisheries, about 2 million metric tons, and if I got my math right, that's about 4 billion pounds, right? This is big. This is as big as any industrial scale fishery that you could think of in the world. If we look at this lake, right, just this one part of the lake, we're talking about 1.2 million people live on this lake. They're all involved in fishing in some way, right, either subsistence or commercial, and it's got a huge annual catch in and of itself. So this leads to some fundamental questions that myself and people that I work with are trying to ask, which is, why is this piece of water, this piece of fresh water, so amazingly productive? Why does it produce so much fish? It's an unanswered question. We don't know. And then, to extend on this, we know the system's changing. I'll talk more about that. But it's changing. How do we use our understanding of how this system works and get out of our comfort zone to try to bring in some design principles to improve outcomes for people? Can we do things to kind of mitigate losses of this resource by working interdisciplinary? So one of the things we know about the Tonle Sap and the Mekong that's really important about it is that it's what we call a flood pulse ecosystem. So this is an animation here of the flood pulse in the Tonle Sap Lake. And down on the bottom, I've got the lake level. And in the low water, this lake is maybe 4 feet deep, right? You can stand up in the middle of the lake. It's a giant mud puddle. is what it is, right? In the high water, it's 10 meters, it's 30 feet deep. It's a massive change in terms of the lake. The area goes from about 2,000 square kilometers at the low phase to about 12,000 square kilometers when it's at full flood stage. And this is seasonal, it's repeatable, it's predictable. It happens every year, and it happens every year at about the same time. And everybody and everything in this system has adapted to this annual flood, this massive annual flood. So on the lake itself, there's these floating villages, and about 1 million people live in these floating villages around the lake where they're entirely water-based. The village moves with the lake edge, so they'll move when it's flooding, the village will move itself out into the flooded forest, and when the lake contracts, it'll move down, the whole village will move down into the middle of the lake. If you're not on a floating house, you're on stilts. That's the other option for you, and you can see that this is at obviously the low water period, and this is where you would expect the high water to be. It's a massive, massive change, and everything about life is built around this flood. It's also true for the biology of the system. All sorts of biological adaptations to this flood. This is one of my personal favorites. This is the walking catfish, Claris petrachus. And this fish has a kind of modified little pouch that acts almost as a lung, so it's an air breather, right? It can spend multiple days outside of water, actually, breathing air. And what it does is, it's able to deal with very low oxygen conditions. So when the lake is shrinking and the water is getting low and there's fish in there and all the oxygen is getting used up, the fish will sit there and tough it out because it can do that. And then all of a sudden, when the water totally disappears, it'll bury itself down in the mud. And then when the mud dries up, it gets up and it walks to the next pond, right? And so it's got these pectoral fins where it can sit and walk itself over to the next pond, plop in, off it goes. This is a direct adaptation to this really dynamic flood environment. This is going to change. And the reason is hydropower development. The Mekong there's somewhere, the number changes all the time. Some people, it's upwards of 300 dams that are either proposed, planned or under construction or completed. There are a number of dams, about 4 in China on the upper part of the basin that are on the main stem. There's one that was recently closed in Laos that's on the main stem. Number of tributary dams that have been put into place, and it's growing. This is happening. Laos is all in on hydropower development. They're going to be the battery of Southeast Asia. So this is going to really change the way this system works. And it's not unique to the Mekong. Some colleagues here published a paper fairly recently where they noted that here's the Mekong and all the planned and proposed dams, but here's the Congo and the Amazon. And in fact, most of these large tropical rivers are areas where you have these freshwater fisheries that are really important for people, but they're also relatively undeveloped now because this is developing economies. They're looking for sources of power, and they're looking at these rivers and saying, hey, this is a place where we can get power that's clean, relatively cheap. We're going to make these changes. And so this is really it's not just a Mekong thing, it's a global thing, and it's going to impact a lot of places. So overall, our group, we're taking what we call a food, energy, water perspective of this challenge. And we're trying to kind of analyze the system within this context. And here, the energy and the water, well, the energy is related to this hydropower development, but also climate change. Climate change is going to change how water cycles in this system. In particular, in Southeast Asia, the expectation is there'll be a shift in the timing of when the monsoons come. Both of those things are going to change that flood pulse dynamic. The predictions are that it's not going to change the magnitude too much. There's still going to be a lot of water in the system. It's going to change the timing of how that water comes out. It's going to change the nature of that flood cycle. We're then asking, well, what does that mean for the food system? And in this case, we're talking about fish and rice. This is a fish and rice culture. These are the primary staples of the system. So we're thinking about fish and rice in terms of their production, but we're also thinking about it in terms of their quality. Right? And what we mean here is that there's reasons to believe that, and I'll show you some information on this, is that changing this environment, changing this flood regime is going to change the amount of fish that's produced, but it's also going to change whether they're good to eat and whether they have the essential nutrients that we want to get out of these fish. Ultimately, this all works into regional food security, and hopefully we can take this knowledge and use it to do smart things with the infrastructure to try to mitigate some of the losses of the damming of the river. Okay, so this is a pretty busy figure, and what this just shows is that this hydrology of this lake is going to change with hydropower and climate change. And I'll just give you the punchline, and it's shown down here in the bottom right, is that the prediction is this lake is the amount of flooding, the distance kind of out into the floodplain is largely going to remain the same. But the timing is going to change. Instead of having a nice, slow, gradual flood that comes back, it's going to go like this. It's going to be much shorter in duration, same extent, but much shorter in duration. So areas that are typically underwater for maybe 2, 3, or 4 months are now going to be underwater for a couple weeks or a month. And so with this knowledge about how the hydrology is going to change, what does that mean for the biology? And I'll give you a few examples here. The first one is just asking about primary productivity. Think of this as fish food, right? This is algae growing in the lake, and the rate at which algae is being produced, which is an important source of food for the fish. Not the only source. Talk about that more later, but fish food, partly. And what we've got here in this black line, this is kind of how primary production maps out over the course of a flood cycle, currently in the dotted black line. And the gold line is how that would change under a hydropower scenario, and you see it goes down, and goes down by a lot. It's like 40%. And then the red is hydropower plus a climate change scenario. And so you can see that climate change has an effect, for sure, but the real action is hydropower. That's really going to change how this works. And it's going to lower this primary productivity in this system. It's going to lower that overall baseline capacity to fuel the food web, which ultimately makes the fish that are being caught. So that's one view. That's the kind of algae side. I want to highlight here, this is my PhD student who's going to finish up here pretty soon. Ben Miller, he's in the room, and he's studying kind of not only the algal side, but the opposite side, which is the heterotrophic side. So a lot of these ecosystems are fueled by bacteria that are chewing on detritus and growing bacterial populations, and then maybe a bug or even a fish comes in and eats that bacteria, and then another fish eats that bug, and on up. So this is the microbial loop. There's this whole side of productivity that is not based on algae, but is based on detritus. And he's looking at the details of how the flood cycle influences this detrital food pathway. And put together, that kind of sets the whole energetic base for this ecosystem. And if we understand how the flood is impacting that, we can then think about, well, where are ways that we can design this flood to maximize these processes. What's interesting, again, another busy figure, I'm sorry, is that fish eat different things, and as a result, they actually are different in their nutritional quality for people. And so this is just a non-dimensional scaling plot used to group different fishes, and here they're being grouped by what fatty acids are in their tissues. And you got 3 main groups. You got the groups up here at the top, you got the groups in the bottom, and then these weird ones over here, right? And then the dots on this are how much of those fish fatty acids are polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are the good fats, right? These are the ones we're all supposed to eat. This is ones that are in salmon, the omega-3s that are good for neurologic health, good for heart health. And what you see, and the only point I want you to get out of this, is that there's a group of fish that are pretty high in this, but there's other groups that are actually really low. Not all fish are equal nutritionally. Some are really good, some maybe not so good. So not only are we need to think about growing more fish, but maybe we need to think about growing fish that have the right kind of nutrients. Conversely, there's contaminants in the system. Mercury is something we might try to avoid. And we could do a similar exercise to try to minimize the bad stuff while maximizing the good stuff. I'll just say that this population is low in those key omega-3 fatty acids. That's one of the key nutrients that they need. So this is an important area for that place in particular. So that was kind of the nutritional composition side. Now I'm going to talk about the fish production side and highlight a paper a few years old with some colleagues where we were able to get this published in Science, for better or for worse. And this focused on what's called the Dai fishery in Cambodia. And this is a fishery that's really, really tightly linked to this flood pulse. It's a fishery that targets migrating fish that are leaving the lake when the floods start to recede. One strategy for fish in that scenario is just to get out of town. And this fishery targets them. And here's a video of this fishery. So up here at the top, we've got the anchor point. So that's the mouth of this net, and we're looking upstream. And fish are migrating downstream, and they run into these nets as they're doing it. And these guys here are taking and they're pushing all the fish down this net. And eventually, they'll get it in the net, and they'll pull out the back end and drop it on the deck of that house and kind of up. And when this is going, when this migration is happening, they're pulling out large quantities of fish. It runs 24 hours a day. They're pulling the net every hour. And it lasts from about October in through March. So then we asked, and this is important because this fishery represents pretty much the best data set that we have available in terms of what's being caught in the Mekong. It goes back to 1995. Lots of troubled political history in this part of the world prior to that, so there's just not a lot of information out there. So this is what we got. And what we did was we said, okay, we've got this catch data. We can look at it year by year, and some years there were a lot of fish were caught, some years not so much fish were caught. We can look at the hydrology associated with it, and we can say, well, you know, in some years you got really high floods, and some years you had low floods. Maybe in some years you had long floods or short ones. How about the drought side? In some years there was a long drought, maybe some years there was a short drought. So we went through and quantified all the years, and we quantified these anomalies from the normal. So this represents the normal hydrology, and then these represents deviations of, say, for a high flood in a given year, or a low flood, or a long flood, whatnot. And we looked at all these metrics and then compared them to the catch data to say, hey, what is it about the flood more than just more is good? Are there certain aspects of the flood that maximize the amount of fish that we get? And I'll give you the formula, right? Here's the formula. The two things that popped out is magnitude of the flood is really important. We knew that, bigger floods, more fish. The interesting one was the duration of the low water period was equally important. And so we got a formula, right? It's long lows followed by high highs. That's the formula. That's, if you want to maximize fish production, long lows followed by high highs. That's great, you know, in an academic sense, but it's also really good in a operational sense, because this is something, the timing with all the dams being built means that the system is becoming increasingly regulated, and that's something that is potentially changeable. If we had a formula, if we had an objective function for what floods should look like to produce fish, we could take that to the dams and say, hey, let's try to mitigate some of the losses to these fisheries based on the damming efforts by designing hydrology that's going to meet the needs of these fish and try to increase fish production. This is the part of trying to get those disciplines together. Okay, this figure here shows that damming has occurred in the Mekong, and what it's done has changed these hydrology metrics for the worse, right? So the flood pulse has been decreasing, and this one's a little odd. It says net annual anomalies increasing, but a subcomponent of that is that drought period, which is actually getting shorter. Take my word for it. New project, super fired up about this. This just kind of came online really recently. Last January, a colleague of mine went to the Mekong and we installed bioacoustic sensors, so sonar to count fish as a kind of a test project, and we were able to get it funded. So now we're going to try to install these sensors in this fishery to count fish in real time and relate it to these hydrology metrics, so that we can really kind of see what's going on at a fine, detailed level. Ultimately, we want to put these sensors all around the basin so we can look at how fish move and how it relates to this flood dynamic with this potential for management. And then lastly, you know, this is all feeding into a much larger project, and I know you've already heard from Faisal and Becca, who are key members of this project, but we're trying to take all these parts and put them together. We're looking at the fish, we're looking at the rice, Faisal and Bart are looking at the hydrology and giving us future hydrologic scenarios. And we're trying to put this all together and come up with these objective functions. What do we gotta do? How do we gotta make a hydrograph that maximizes fish production, rice production, fish quality, rice quality? Engineers for a long time have known how to run dams to maximize energy. Can we add the biology to that by working together? I want to acknowledge the students that have been on this project. We sit around and think these things up, and these folks are the ones that do the work, right? They're the ones that are out there doing the work. They've been incredible to work with. So again, we're trying to come up with these ecological objective functions that maximize these societal benefits, whatever they are, put them together in a comprehensive framework where we can evaluate trade-offs. Right, so this is a diagram of a Pareto frontier that is probably pretty familiar to most engineers, and it's just saying, hey, there's gonna be multiple possible optimums depending on what your goals are. Maybe your goals is to maximize energy production, maybe it's to maximize fish production. Let's evaluate what those trade-offs are and look for ways that we can try to do the most good with what we got. And so we're all aimed at putting these together and coming up with these optimization scenarios that we can then take to the policymakers and give them these trade-offs and say, hey, this is what, if you do this, this is what you can expect. These are the trade-offs you're gonna see. So I borrowed this from Ray Hilborn, who is not sleeping in the front here, sorry Ray, but it's really cool. He uses this to highlight how eating fish and is a conservation thing to do is something that we've actually known for a long time, right? This is a Works Progress Administration poster from just before World War II saying, hey, we need to save resources for the war effort. Why don't you go eat fish? Because they feed themselves. It's a good thing to do. We can save those agricultural products. I'll point out, Ray, these are all freshwater fish. So here's to sum it up. Environmental change is really gonna affect people's ability to get healthy food, and this is gonna be disproportionately felt by relatively poor people. Wild fisheries, these are something we get for free right now. We should be working to maintain those because they're good for people and we get them relatively cheap. Water is this critical link, right? And it's not just the amount of water, it's the timing of the water as well. So we got to think about how we're going to manage our water in order to maximize these benefits. So the last thing I want to talk about is another thing I'm super excited about that is also brand new. So I've talked to you about the Mekong and some of the work we're doing there. This is in no way unique for the University of Washington. The University of Washington is engaged broadly in these issues around freshwater sustainability. This is just a small sampling of the areas where where UW faculty are working around freshwater sustainability issues. We're touching the globe, right? We're working around the globe on some of these issues. So with this in mind, myself and a group of faculty that were participants in the freshwater initiative that Lisa mentioned set out to establish and get funding for a new graduate training program, which we call Future Rivers. And this is an interdisciplinary graduate training program around river sustainability. Our goal here is to train our graduate students to be that T-shaped scientist, right? That one that's deep in their area, but also broadly connected. We've got a number of activities and educational goals. These are all built around requests from our students. They want this, right? They came to us and asked for it. So we're gonna do technical and data science skills. We're gonna do activities to foster this interdisciplinary integration. We're gonna do workshops and other activities to try to promote science communication and equity in the STEM field. And then we're gonna create opportunities for these students to network out into their future careers. It's all brand new. We just found out about this funding a few months ago, and we're getting the program established. We're going to accept our first cohort next fall, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. So, kind of to wrap it up, these are our really important large-scale problems, and they're problems that are going to be a challenge for us to deal with. But the way we're going to deal with them is by getting out of our comfort zone, working with a lot of people with diverse perspectives and diverse ideas, and that's what we're trying to do here. So I want to thank folks that have helped to make that happen, and I think it might be time for questions. Thank you.